ocean covers 71% of the Earth. We have explored less than 5% of it. Nobody talks about what that actually means. It means that the largest space on this planet is almost entirely unknown to us. It means that whatever lives at the bottom of it has had hundreds of millions of years to exist, to grow, to wait, completely undisturbed. The ocean keeps things, old things, things it has no obligation to show us. But sometimes the water pulls back further than it should. And sometimes what it exposes on the seafloor was never meant to be found. If this is the kind of story you're into, hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Every single like and subscription helps this channel reach more people. And we are genuinely grateful for every one of you who keeps coming back. Now, let's dive into today's story. The tide didn't just go out, it peeled back the ocean. What it exposed was still moving, even though it had clearly been dead longer than humanity. My name is Dr. Valoran Quist. I map things that shouldn't exist. That is not a metaphor, and it is not a figure of speech. It is my actual profession, which I arrived at through a long series of academic decisions that made perfect sense at the time, and which I would make again, even knowing where they led me. I map underwater formations in the wrong place. Thermal vents with no geological source. Trenches that appear on depth surveys, and then, on the next pass, don't. Currents that reverse against everything fluid dynamics says is possible, in regions of the ocean where nothing should cause a reversal. I have spent 30 years doing this, and in those 30 years, I have only once felt the specific quality of dread that I felt the morning of October 15th, standing on the beach at Crale's Point with wet sand soaking through my shoes, watching the ocean disappear. I need you to understand what I mean when I say disappear. Not a low tide. Not the water pulling back 50 yards the way it does after a storm surge on a shallow beach. I mean, the ocean was there, and then it was not, in a way that defied the mechanics of how water behaves. The harbor was empty. The near-shore reefs were exposed. The sandbars that normally lurked 2 feet beneath the surface at low tide were sitting in open air, glistening in the gray October morning. And beyond them, stretching out to what should have been open sea, miles of exposed seabed lay bare and wet and still, as far as I could see in any direction. Things were dying in the open air, pale creatures from the deep nearshore zone, things that had never once in their lives been exposed to sunlight, curling and spasming on the cold, wet sand. Amphipods, bristle worms, something with too many legs that I could not name and did not want to. But none of that is what held my attention. What held my attention was the shape on the horizon. It sat at the edge of where the seabed curved away from visibility, maybe 3 miles out, maybe 4. In the flat, gray, early morning light, it was a silhouette, dark and enormous against the pale sky. And even from that distance, even without any instrument more precise than my own eyes, I could tell it was not a rock formation. I had been looking at geological formations my entire professional life. I had spent weeks at a time studying sonar images of underwater ridges and collapsed volcanic arcs and ancient reef structures. I knew what rock looked like at distance, the irregular, weathered profile of something that had been shaped by water and time. This was not that. This was a structure. and it was very slowly, almost imperceptibly, turning toward the shore. I had seen this once before. I was 23 years old and doing field work on the coast of northern Norway for my graduate thesis. I was sleep deprived and underfunded, and I had been eating badly for 3 weeks. I saw the tide go out further than it should have, and I saw a shape on the horizon, and I wrote down everything I witnessed over the next 6 hours. And I submitted a report to my supervisor, who read it, set it down carefully on his desk, and told me I had been pushing myself too hard and should take the weekend off. The report was filed and never referenced again. But I had photographs. I had taken them on a cheap 35mm camera I carried everywhere that summer. And I had developed the film myself and tucked the prints into the back of a water-damaged journal that I have carried with me, inside a locked drawer in my luggage for 30 years. Every single survey trip, every overnight stay, in every harbor town, on every coastline I have ever worked. The journal went with me. I took it out of my coat pocket, standing there on the beach at Crale's Point, and I held it for a moment without opening it. And I watched the shape on the horizon turn. The first person I found on the beach that morning was Maro Thesk. She is 63 years old, built low and solid, with the kind of hands that come from 40 years of prying things off rocks at low tide. She has an encyclopedic knowledge of every creature that lives in every tide pool along this stretch of the northern coast. She knows which pools hold what species in which season. She knows what the color of certain anemones means about water temperature. She knows which birds feed on which shellfish at which depth of low tide. She has never held an academic position or published a paper in her life, and she understands this coastline better than anyone I have ever met with letters after their name. She was standing exactly at the edge of where the surf line used to be, holding a wicker basket she had clearly forgotten to fill. And she was not looking at the dying creatures on the exposed sand. She was not looking at the harbor, or at the empty mooring lines hanging slack in the air where they had once trailed down into the water. She was looking out at the horizon, at the shape. I stood beside her, and she didn't acknowledge me for a long moment. The wind off the exposed seabed was different than usual. Not stronger, just different in a way I couldn't immediately name. A quality of stillness inside the movement of it, like the air itself was unsure of something. Finally, without looking at me, Maro said, "This isn't from the ocean." I told her I didn't understand what she meant. She said, "The sea has moods. I've watched it my whole life. Some mornings it's angry, and you can feel it before you reach the beach. The air changes. Some mornings it's grieving. The light on the water looks wrong. The birds won't go near the shoreline. This morning, it let something go. Something it didn't want anymore. Something it's been keeping down for a very long time." She turned and looked at me then, fully, with the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time to say something out loud. "That thing out there, it's been turning since I got here. The angle has changed." I asked her how long she'd been standing there. She said since before 4 a.m. She couldn't sleep. She'd felt something in her house, she said. a vibration in the floorboards that wasn't quite sound. She'd gotten up and walked down to the beach in the dark and found the ocean gone and the shape on the horizon already there, already turning. I asked if the structure looked symmetrical to her from this distance. She looked at it for a long moment before answering. It looks like it used to be, before something happened to it. That one sentence is what made me open the journal right there on the beach, standing in the wet wind with the dying creatures scattered across the sand around us. I opened it to the last page, the one I'd added 15 years after the original event. I didn't read it to her yet. I just looked at it, and then I closed it again, and I stood there trying to decide how afraid I was actually allowed to be. Nick's Calder arrived about 40 minutes after I did. He's the night shift technician responsible for maintaining the tsunami detection arrays along this stretch of coastline. 40 miles of hydrophone buoys and pressure sensors that feed data in real time to the coastal monitoring station up on the bluff. He was 32 years old and had not slept in over 30 hours and had stopped caring about that fact somewhere around the 25th hour. He walked down to us with a tablet computer and a portable monitoring unit and his headset pushed up around his forehead like a visor. And before he even said good morning, he turned the tablet screen toward me and showed me the readouts. Every sensor on the grid was silent. Not malfunctioning, not offline. Silent. They were operational. They were receiving power. They were transmitting. They had simply detected nothing for the past 4 hours, which was impossible because even in the flattest, calmest water conditions, a functioning pressure sensor in a 40-mile coastal array will pick up something. A passing boat, a current shift, a whale diving at depth. There's always something. 4 hours of complete silence across 40 miles of instrumented coastline meant one of two things. Either every single sensor had somehow failed simultaneously, or there was genuinely nothing in the water for them to detect. There was no water. Nix had a theory. He told me he was embarrassed by it, that it sounded like the kind of thing someone would say after not sleeping for 30 hours, which he acknowledged was exactly the situation he was in. I told him to say it anyway. He said he didn't think the water had been pushed away from the coast. He thought it had been pulled away from the seabed, pulled up in some direction that wasn't exactly vertical, drawn away from the ocean floor first, and then released outward in all directions, at once the way pressure releases from a sealed container when the seal breaks. He said he thought the displacement had originated from below the ocean floor, not above it. Something had drawn the water toward itself, held it, and let it go. And the thing that had done that was still out there on the horizon. I told him to say it again, slower. Not because I hadn't understood him, because I wanted to hear it twice. He said it again. The ocean, Nick said quietly, looking at his silent monitors, isn't behaving like a body of water that was disturbed. It's behaving like a body of water that was held and then released. Those are different things. He was right. They were entirely different things. Edrith Soul had been living on his salvage barge in the harbor for the past 3 weeks, while he worked a survey contract on a wreck about 6 miles offshore. The remains of a small cargo vessel that had gone down in a storm 40 years ago and had never been fully salvaged. He was 29 and needed a shave, and had the permanent squint of someone who spends most of their waking hours staring at small monitors in low light conditions. He made his living sending drones over sunken wrecks, capturing footage and measurements, occasionally recovering cargo for insurance companies or artifacts for private collectors. He was good at it. He had the patience for it, the willingness to sit with a monitor for 6 hours, waiting for a drone to complete a pass over something interesting. When the harbor emptied and his barge settled onto the exposed seabed with a long groan of metal on wet sand, he did not panic. He barely reacted. He just launched a drone. He patched the live feed to his laptop screen and walked down to where we were standing on the beach and set the laptop on a piece of driftwood so we could all see. The footage was extraordinary. The exposed seabed, seen from 200 feet in the air, was nothing like any ocean floor I had surveyed in 3 decades of fieldwork. I want to be precise about this because precision matters, and I refuse to be the kind of person who reaches for dramatic language when accurate language serves better. What I saw in that footage was a seabed that should not have existed at this depth and at this distance from shore. The formations were wrong. Massive ridges of dark stone arranged in configurations that had no geological explanation I could immediately identify. Not the gradual undulation of a sandy nearshore floor, not the rocky, irregular terrain of a reef system, not the sediment-buried flatness of a deeper shelf environment. These were formations that looked almost deliberate in their arrangement, the way something looks deliberate when you stare at it long enough and realize the probability of randomness producing this particular configuration is low enough to be meaningful. And the thing on the horizon, seen through the drone camera at range, was larger than I had understood from the shore. Much larger. It rose from the seabed the way a building rises from the earth, except no building I have ever seen has that quality of having once been something else, something biological, something that had a function and a purpose, and had been sitting unused for so long that the distinction between organic and architectural had been lost somewhere in the sediment. It was covered in deep ocean crust, layers of it, the kind of accretion that takes not decades, but centuries, possibly millennia. And it was turning. Not quickly. Not visibly, if you watched it for only a minute or two. But it was turning toward the shore with the slow, deliberate patience of something that had been waiting for a very specific moment and understood that the specific moment was close. Then the drone feed ended. Not signal loss, not a crash. The feed simply terminated, the way a call ends when someone on the other end hangs up, deliberately, cleanly. Edrith took his goggles off and set them down on the driftwood next to the laptop and stared at the black screen for a moment. Then he said, "It saw the drone." Nobody argued with him. Elira Vosk arrived without being called. She had heard about the event on her radio during her morning walk and had turned around and come straight to the beach without going home to change. She was 61, and she had spent 20 years piloting deep-sea submersibles for a government oceanic survey program that she was not allowed to discuss in any specific detail, had been told not to discuss it in any specific detail, had in fact signed documents that were very clear about what she was and was not permitted to say. Her retirement had been, in her words, arranged. Arranged was the exact word she used, and the way she said it communicated clearly that the arrangement had not been negotiated. She sat down on the driftwood beside the laptop and watched Edrith's footage from the beginning. She did not react expressively. She watched with the steady, evaluating attention of someone reviewing operational data. Her eyes moving methodically across the screen. When the feed cut, she sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "I know this terrain." She explained what she meant carefully and without apparent emotion. The ridge formations in the drone footage corresponded to terrain she had seen on classified mission footage during her final submersible deployment. That mission had taken her to an unnamed trench at a depth she was not permitted to specify, but which she said was significantly deeper than the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench, which at nearly 36,000 feet below the surface is the deepest confirmed point on Earth. At that depth, something had pressed against the outside of the hull of her submersible. All 3 members of the crew had reacted, she said. She would not describe how they had reacted. The external cameras had been removed from the sub before it surfaced. She had never been deployed again. "Whatever is out there," she said, gesturing toward the horizon, did not come up from beneath the ocean floor. The floor is not deep enough. It came up through it. She said this with the same tone she might use to report a weather condition. Not because she was not afraid. I have known enough people who have been through genuinely terrifying things to recognize the particular flatness that comes from having processed the fear privately, alone, over a long period of time, and having arrived at the point where saying the true thing out loud is simply easier than continuing not to say it. Torvek Halcyon drove in from his monitoring station up the coast around mid-morning. He was an acoustic physicist, mid-50s, the kind of man who had spent so long listening to sounds that most people could not hear that he had developed a permanent slight tilt to his head, as if he were always listening to something just at the edge of audibility. He had been stationed at a research buoy about 12 miles north of Crale's Point for the past 2 weeks, studying low-frequency resonance in the deep water channel that ran along this stretch of coast. He had been recording something for 4 days that he had been attributing to geological activity, a low-frequency signal from somewhere beneath the seabed in the general direction of where the structure now sat exposed on the horizon. He played it for us on his portable equipment. I am going to try to describe the sound, and I want to acknowledge up front that I may not be able to do it adequately. It was low, lower than you would expect to hear from a portable speaker, the kind of frequency that you don't process as sound in the conventional sense, but as a physical sensation, a pressure in the chest cavity, a vibration that seemed to originate somewhere in the bone rather than in the air. It had a rhythm, not a complex rhythm, something simple and slow and enormously patient, the rhythm of something that has been doing the same thing for a very long time and sees no reason to change pace. And then Torvek told us what the numbers said. The intervals between pulses were shortening, had been shortening for 4 days. At the current rate of acceleration, the pulses would converge, reaching a terminal frequency, a final loudest single instance, in approximately 14 hours. Morrow asked what happens at the terminal frequency. Torvik said that in his field, a signal that counts down to something usually counts down to something opening. The silence after that was long and specific. The kind of silence that forms when a group of people are all processing the same information and arriving at the same conclusion, and none of them wants to be the first to say it out loud. It was around midday when Severin Caleth appeared. Black SUV on the beach access road, gray coat, laminated identification, satellite phone, government containment liaison. He was calm in the way that men are calm when they have been briefed for a situation and have arrived inside the parameters of what the briefing described. He walked down toward the group, and before he had even reached us, before any introductions had been made, he asked his question. Has it started opening yet? Not frantically, not with urgency. The way you ask about something you have been tracking from a distance and are now close enough to check on directly. I said not yet, that there was a seam visible on the structure's face, but that it had not widened significantly in the past hour. He nodded like this was acceptable news that would not remain acceptable for long. He introduced himself. He asked to be brought up to speed. We brought him up to speed. He listened carefully and asked clarifying questions that were precise and specific in ways that told me he already knew the answers to most of them and was verifying rather than learning. When Elira described the terrain, she recognized from her classified deployment he did not react at all, which told me that the mission she had been on was not unknown to him. When we finished, he said, "The structure is not supposed to be visible at this depth. That's what I can tell you." Elira asked him what he meant by supposed to. He said, "There are things in the deep ocean that have been there for a very long time, longer than our instruments have been looking, longer than our instruments are capable of detecting when they aren't looking in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. Most of them don't move. Most of them don't signal. This one has been doing both, intermittently, for decades. We've known about it. We've been monitoring it." Nick said, "And you didn't think that was worth telling anyone?" Severin looked at him. He said, "We told the people we thought needed to know." Elira cornered him alone about an hour later, backed him up against the wall of the coastal monitoring station, with one arm braced against the cinder block, and her face about 6 inches from his. She was not dramatic about it. She simply made it physically difficult for him to avoid the conversation. She asked him straight whether he knew what would happen to the shoreline if the structure opened fully. He met her eyes. He said, "Not exactly, but the models suggest the radius is considerable." Then he straightened his coat and walked back toward his car, and he sat inside it with the engine running and his satellite phone to his ear for the rest of the afternoon. Morrow watched him go, she said, without particular emphasis. He's not here to stop anything. He's here to watch it finish and report back. I opened the journal to the last page. Nix and Elira and Maro and Torvik and Edrith stood in a loose half-circle on the wet sand, and I read it aloud. The entry was dated 15 years after the original event I had witnessed at 23. I had written it after finding archival records of 3 similar incidents, 2 from the 20th century and 1 from the late 19th, all from different coastlines, all with the same basic profile. The tide going out far beyond its normal range. A shape at the horizon. And then, each time, before anything came of it, the tide coming back. I had spent years trying to understand what brought the tide back in each of those historical cases. Why the structure submerged again before anything conclusive happened. Why whatever was inside stayed inside. I had one theory, and the theory rested on something I had read years earlier about a sound that Noe had recorded in the South Pacific in 1997. They had called it the bloop. It was an ultra-low frequency sound so loud that it had been detected by hydrophone arrays nearly 5,000 kilometers apart. The official eventual explanation was an ice calving event off Antarctica. And that explanation was probably correct. But before the explanation was settled, researchers had noted something in the sound's profile that had stuck with me when I first read it. The signal rose in pitch over the course of a full minute. A rising frequency. The acoustic signature of a call. And buried in the appendix of one of the early NOAA analysis papers, there was a note about a resonance change in the surrounding hydrophone data, a low response signal, detected approximately 4 hours after the original bloop, from a direction that didn't correspond to any known ice formation. I had read that note a dozen times over the years. I had never been able to determine what had produced the response signal, but I had always thought about the timing. Because the tide had come back at the site of my own witnessed event 31 years ago, approximately 4 hours after the exposure began. And in 2 of the 3 archival cases I had found, the timing was similar. The structure was calling. It had been calling on and off for decades, possibly longer. And somewhere in the deep ocean, once, something had answered it, and the tide had come back. I told Torvik what I was thinking. I told him I thought if we could answer the signal, answer it at the right frequency and the right rhythm, not to silence it, but to respond to it, the structure might stop. Not because it was blocked, not because it was damaged, but because it would believe something was already here. Something that had heard it. Something on this side of the door. Torvik was quiet for a long time. He looked at his equipment. He looked at the horizon. He did the calculations in his head, or at least part of them, because I watched his lips move slightly in the way people's lips move when they're working through numbers internally. He said, "You understand what you're describing. You're describing making contact." I said I knew. He said, "And if it answers back?" I said I thought if it answered back, it would do so by deciding to wait. And that waiting was the best outcome available to us. He said, "And if you're wrong?" I said, "Then we find out what happens when it opens, And we find out from closer than anyone has ever found out before. Edrith had been quiet for most of this conversation. He was sitting on the hull of a small dinghy that had been left on its side on the beach, and he had been turning his drone controller over and over in his hands. He had launched a second drone earlier while we were talking, and had walked it out further along the exposed seabed, closer to the structure. He had the footage on his screen. He had watched it alone. When we finished talking about Torvek's countersignal, Edrith looked up and said quietly that there was something we needed to see. He turned the screen toward us. The seam on the structure's face was wider, significantly wider than it had been when we'd last looked. And from the seam, barely visible in the drone footage at that range, something was moving. Not emerging. Not visible in any coherent way. But where the sealed edges of the structure had been, there was now a darkness that was different from the surrounding darkness of the structure's exterior. A density. A quality of not quite stillness that was distinct from everything around it. Edrith said, "It started about 40 minutes ago. Slow, but it's accelerating." Torvek looked at his equipment. The pulse intervals had shortened again. They began setting up the transmitter. While they worked, the ground changed. It started small, the way bad things often do. A vibration in the sand beneath our feet, vertical and rhythmic, like something very large was pressing upward from below in slow, even pulses. It was not the rolling lateral shake of an earthquake. It was something pressing from below the seabed with an intention that felt nothing like geology. Nix's sensors detected it before we felt it clearly. He looked at his readouts, and his face went through several expressions in quick succession and settled on something that was not quite calm, but was trying very hard to be. Then the fissures opened, long cracks in the exposed seabed, running roughly parallel to each other, extending from the direction of the structure toward the shore, like something had dragged fingers across the ocean floor. They opened slowly, each one a foot wide, 2 feet, the wet sand and ancient stone splitting apart with a sound that carried across the exposed seabed in the still air. A long, tearing sound, low and prolonged and deeply wrong. And out of the fissures, things came. They were pale. All of them were pale. The specific bloodless white of creatures that have spent their entire existence in the complete absence of light. Not the adaptive pale of cavefish or deep sea fauna that have simply lost the need for pigment over generations, but something that seemed more fundamental. A whiteness that went all the way through them, as if color itself was a concept they had no architecture for. They moved on multiple limbs, too many limbs for anything I could confidently classify, jointed in ways that weren't wrong exactly, but were unexpected enough to be disorienting. They were various sizes, from things the length of my hand to things longer than I was tall, and all of them were moving in the same direction, away from the structure, toward the shore, toward us and past us, indifferent to our presence, not aggressive, not curious, not reactive to us in any way. They were simply leaving, evacuating, running from whatever was happening inside the thing on the horizon with the specific purposefulness of animals that knew on some deep cellular level that they did not want to be anywhere near what was about to happen. Morrow watched them come. She stood completely still as they moved around her feet and past her, and she watched each one with the careful attention she gave to everything in the tide pools. After a long moment, she said, "They've been living inside it their whole lives. Whatever they are, they were born in it, and it just told them to get out." She paused. That's not a good sign. When the structure decides it doesn't need its residents anymore, that's not a good sign at all. The transmitter took 40 minutes to set up. Torvek calibrated it against the signal from the structure, which by now was audible without any equipment, a deep, resonant pulse that you felt in your back teeth and in the base of your skull and in the hollow of your chest. Nyx ran cables through the wet sand. Elira held the housing of the transmitter steady against the wind, which had picked up, which was itself strange because the sky was cloudless and the conditions had been dead calm all morning. The wind was coming off the exposed seabed, off the wet stone, and the dying creatures, and the open fissures. And it smelled like nothing I could name, not salt and not sulfur, and not any of the organic decay smells of a conventional low tide. Something older, something that had been sealed away from the air for a very long time. Edrith was on the seabed. He had taken his last functioning drone and a radio and walked out onto the exposed ocean floor while we were setting up the transmitter. And nobody had stopped him, partly because nobody had the authority to stop him, and partly because the expression on his face made it clear that the obsession that had begun when the first drone feed cut had become something that was no longer entirely within his own control. He had walked out about a mile, maybe a mile and a half, and he had stopped at the edge of one of the large fissures and was looking down into it and transmitting what he saw over the radio in a flat, steady voice that was doing a great deal of work to remain flat and steady. He said the structure was visible from there, not the exterior, the interior. Through the widening seam, he could see something that he described at first as darkness, and then amended to say it wasn't darkness exactly. It was the absence of the quality that made darkness look like darkness, which he acknowledged didn't make sense, and he was doing his best. He said the inside of the structure didn't have the visual character of any space he had ever looked into. He said it was like looking at a photograph of a space rather than a space itself. He said something was moving in there. He said it with the particular tone of voice that people use when they have committed to describing something they would very much prefer not to describe, because someone needs to know, and they are the only one close enough to see. We activated the transmitter. The counter signal went out across the exposed seabed, traveling through the air and through the wet sand and through the ancient stone beneath it. It matched the frequency and the rhythm of the structure's own pulse, the same tone, the same interval, the same patient, slow repetition. Torvek had tuned it carefully. He stood with his hands on the housing of the transmitter and his eyes closed, and he listened to the signal going out, and he made 2 small adjustments in the first 30 seconds, and then stood still. On the radio, Edrith went quiet. The structure's pulse came once more, slow and low paused. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. Not silence in a sense of no sound. Silence in the sense of everything stopping at once. Every ambient noise of the exposed seabed. The wind, the dying creatures, the distant settling of stone. All of it dropping away simultaneously, as if whatever was out on the horizon had drawn a breath and was holding it. Edrith's voice came over the radio. He said, "The seam stopped moving. Something is different. The air is different. I don't know how to explain the air being different, but it is." A long pause. Then, "It's listening." Then, a longer silence. Then, "I think it heard us." The water came back. Not the way a tide rolls in, not a surge, not a gradual rise from the waterline outward. The water came from everywhere at once, as if the ocean had been hovering just below the surface of the seabed and suddenly been released, welling up through the sand, seeping up through the open fissures, rising around Edrith's feet in warm streams before he had time to process what was happening and begin running. It did not behave the way water behaves. It moved with a uniformity and a purpose that had no natural explanation. Every square foot of the exposed seabed began returning to water at the same rate, at the same moment, in a synchrony that was not possible if the ocean were simply flowing back in from the sides under its own gravity. The water was warm. Edrith said so over the radio, voice now strained with the effort of running through ankle-deep water toward the shore. He said it was warm. He said it was wrong. He said it was warmer than it should be, and also wrong. In some other way he couldn't articulate while running. He made it back. Nix pulled him up onto the sand, and he stood there dripping, shaking, not from cold, holding his drone camera in both hands. The structure was gone, submerged. The horizon was empty. The sky was lightening as the morning moved properly into itself, and the ocean looked entirely, completely, perfectly normal. It sounded normal. It smelled normal, or close enough to normal that you would have to already know what it used to smell like in order to notice the difference. The gulls came back. They circled the harbor mouth and called to each other in the ordinary way. The boats in the harbor began rocking again as the water returned to their hulls. Severin's SUV was gone. We stood at the waterline together, the five of us, and we didn't speak for a while. There was nothing specific to say. We were all processing the same event from our own angles, and the angles were different enough that any sentence any one of us might have started would have immediately illuminated how differently we had just experienced the same 6 hours. And none of us seemed ready for that conversation yet. I took out the journal. I found the last page. I borrowed a pen from Torvek and added a line below everything I had written 15 years earlier. The counter signal worked. The tide returned. The structure submerged. But we didn't stop it. We didn't block it. We didn't damage it or drive it off. We answered it. We told it that something was here, on this side of whatever it was trying to open. And it decided to wait. That is what we actually did today. We told it we exist. We confirmed it. We gave it the one piece of information it needed. Maro read it over my shoulder. She is a fast reader, despite not looking like one. She said, "It'll come back." I said, "I knew." Nix asked how long we had. Nobody answered him, not because we didn't have a number in mind, because saying the number out loud felt like it would make the number real in a way that none of us were prepared for at that moment. Edrith sat down in the sand, away from the rest of us, and he looked at the screen on his drone camera. He had saved the footage from the run he'd done standing at the fissure, the close footage, the footage from the moment just before the water came back. He had not shown it to anyone. He watched it now, alone, and his face did several things that faces do when they are trying not to do anything in particular and not entirely succeeding. The footage showed the seam on the structure's face, stopped, not closed, stopped, the way a door stops when someone is holding it from the other side. And in the gap, in the space between the sealed edges that had been widening all morning, there was something, not a creature, not a shape, not anything that Edrith had the vocabulary to describe accurately over the radio, or that I have the vocabulary to describe accurately now. Something that occupied the gap the way a presence occupies a room before you have turned on the light and confirmed what is in it. A quality of the darkness behind the opening that suggested the darkness was not empty, and was not passive, and was not indifferent to the camera pointed at it. In the last 2 seconds of the footage, before the water rose and obscured the fissure and the seam and the structure itself, something in that gap moved, not toward the opening, not away from it, laterally, with the unhurried, deliberate movement of something that has just registered the existence of a thing it did not previously know was there. The movement of something that has found something new to be patient about. Edrith's thumb found the delete button on the side of the camera. He held it there for a long time. He did not press it. He sat in the sand with the footage on the screen and the ocean moving in slow, slightly wrong waves behind him, and he looked at the last frame, and he did not press delete. The water is still warm. 2 days later, standing on the same beach, I can confirm the water is still warm. Morrow says it smells different. Not strongly, not obviously, only if you have spent 40 years learning what this specific water smells like, and you pay close attention. She says it smells like something is in it that wasn't there before. Not contamination, not pollution. Something that has left a trace of itself in the water, the way a hand leaves warmth in a surface it has touched and moved away from. She says the sea doesn't forget what it's held. In 1997, the NOAA recorded a sound in the South Pacific that was too loud to be any known creature and too complex to be simple geology. They eventually attributed it to an Antarctic icequake. The explanation was reasonable and was probably correct. But the response signal, the one in the appendix of the early analysis paper, the one that came 4 hours later from an indeterminate direction, was never explained. Officially, it was instrument noise. Officially, it was a calibration artifact. Officially, it was nothing. I have read that paper 147 times. I do not think it was nothing. I think the structure heard the bloop the same way it heard Torvek's transmitter. I think it registered a signal and interpreted it as the presence of something worth waiting for. And I think it waited And I think it has been waiting since 1997 with the patience of something that was buried before the first human being drew breath, that has been sealed away from the world it came from for longer than our species has had language to name the experience of waiting. I think we made that wait shorter when we answered it. I think it knows what we are now. The tide went out too far. It pulled back the ocean and left something exposed that should have stayed buried, something older than the seafloor above it, and deeper than the deepest point any instrument of ours has ever reached and touched. Something that had been held down there, not by gravity and not by depth, but by a decision, a deliberate long patience, a willingness to wait in the dark for the right moment and the right signal. And when we sent our counter signal across the exposed seabed, we thought we were closing a door. We thought we were saying, nothing is here, nothing heard you, go back to sleep. But we used the wrong frequency for that message. The frequency we used, the one Torvik matched to the structure's own pulse, the one that made the seam stop widening and the ocean come back, that frequency did not say nothing is here. It said something is here. It said, we hear you. It said, we're here and we heard you. And you are not alone in this. The ocean looks the same. It sounds the same. If you stood on this beach right now and you didn't know what had happened 6 days ago, you would see nothing unusual. Water, horizon, gulls, the ordinary, indifferent vastness of the sea doing what it always does. You would feel the wind and smell the salt, and you would have no reason to feel anything other than what this shoreline has always made people feel, which is small, but comfortably small. Small in the way that reminds you that the world is large and mostly safe, and mostly meant for living in. You would not know that something in the water learned your address. You would not know that it is patient. You would not know that it is counting.